So this tends to come a bit apart, but we continue with chapter 5, More Than Words, called in the book Louder Than Words. Each of the words uttered makes its own contribution to what you will eventually mentally simulate. Blue, ghost, catch and Pac-Man evoke colors, shapes and actions that you can load up into your simulation. But how do you know how to fit them together? How do you know that the ghost is blue and not Pac-Man? How do you know that Pac-Man is about to be caught by the ghost and not the reverse? So the linguistic binding problem is this: how do you assemble the contributions that various words make to simulation so that the right parts go together in the right way? Asked another way, if words provide the cast of characters, props and sets, what directs the action so that the scene plays out in the intended fashion? Assembling words to drive simulation is a complicated operation. But although the binding problem is still hotly debated in literature on cognitive neuroscience of perception, we actually have a pretty good grasp on how language solves its version of this problem. Words are obviously a critically important factor in simulation. They act as pointers to the detailed experiences to be evoked in simulation. But there is more at play in utterances than just words. To know who's yellow and who's blue, and who's chasing after who, to know where to position your mental camera and what to focus on, you need something more than words. You need grammar. Sentences like plants. Linguists have long known that most of a sentence meaning resides in words, and that those words have to get assembled in into longer bits. The analogy that linguists like to use is to liken a sentence to a plant. Words are leaves, the meaty fleshy part, and grammar is the system of branches and stems that hold them in place. Grammar puts sentences together. It's in charge of their form, like the order that words appear in. It ensures that the subject, that blue ghost, comes before the verb is, for instance. And even things like subject-verb agreement. The blue ghost is rather than are. These aspects of the form of sentence are important. They distinguish a string of words that form a viable utterance in a language from a string that's mere gibberish. Randomize a bunch of words and you get something that's unrecognizable as an English sentence. Like blue, that is my Pac-Man, my about catch ghost. Not only is this unrecognizable as English, it's also uninterpretable. The form of a sentence is a large part of what makes its meaning accessible. How exactly does grammar help make meaning? Let's again take the sentence, "That blue ghost is chasing my Pac-Man." When you read it, you know that blue is a property of the ghost and not Pac-Man. You know that because, as a solution to the linguistic binding problem, English has a grammatical rule whereby when you put an adjective, like blue, right ahead of a noun, like ghost, the property that the adjective describes applies to the entity that the noun denotes. This is actually an example of a much more general principle that grammar works with. It's easy to keep track of what needs to be bound to what if you organize words together in larger groupings. All three words in that blue ghost apply to the same entity in the same way the words in my Pac-Man both apply to a single entity. Linguists have a name for a grouping of words like this that's structured around a noun with other bits that modify it, like adjectives, possibly adverbs, and maybe articles like the, or pronouns like my. This is a noun phrase. These combinations of words form units of meaning. The semantic contributions of the words in each noun phrase remain, for the most part, local to that noun phrase. That's how you know that blue applies to ghost and not Pac-Man. But that turns out to be only the beginning of what grammar does to bind the parts of a sentence together. Expanding our view from just the narrow scope of noun phrases to the whole sentence, we might ask, how do we fit together the meaning of the verb with these noun phrases hanging out around it? In this example, you know stuff about the verb chase. For instance, it describes an event that typically involves two entities playing distinct roles. Let's call them the chaser and the chasee. Conveniently, the sentence mentions two entities, that blue ghost and my Pac-Man. So far, so good. But is that blue ghost supposed to be the chaser or the chasee? And how about my Pac-Man? To talk about a chasing event, it's obviously not sufficient to use the word chase and mention the entities that fill its two roles. You also need some means to convey which entity plays which of the verb's roles. This is another thing that grammar does. It indicates which parts of a sentence fill which roles. The way it does this is by mapping specific parts of the form of the sentence, like the order that you mention entities in, onto the verb's roles. In simple transitive sentences in English, like the one we're looking at, the entity mentioned first will be the one performing the action. In this case, the chaser, while the entity mentioned after the verb will be the one the action is performed on, the chassis. As a speaker of English, this is a rule you know. This kind of knowledge about how global structure of a sentence maps onto roles that mentioned entities play in an event is known in the linguistics literature as an argument structure construction, and the particular one in play in this sentence is a transitive constructive construction. Now, to my knowledge, no studies have explicitly investigated how grammatical configurations, like being the subject of a verb or occurring within a noun phrase with another word, affect embodied simulation. This is most likely because it goes almost without saying that if people perform embodied simulations in understanding sentences, they perform different simulations for that blue ghost is about to catch my Pac-Man and my Pac-Man is about to catch that blue ghost. Nevertheless, there is some indirect evidence that the way grammar aligns the semantic contributions of an individual word, of individual words, is reflected in simulation. For instance, recall the action-sentence compatibility effect we saw in the last chapter, in which people move their hands faster when they are performing a movement compatible with the action described in the sentence they're responding to. Well, when we reconsider the stimuli used in these experiments from the perspective of grammar, we see that what the subject and object are can make all the difference to simulation. For instance, the difference between Alex forked over the cash to you, or you forked over the cash to Alex, is whether you or Alex is the subject, and this is expressed by where in the sentence each of these is placed. And yet, this difference is sufficient to drive embodied simulation of actions in the opposite directions. Alex forked over the cash to you, speeds up hand movements toward you. But you forked over the cash to Alex, speeds hand movements away from you. The clear implication is that the motor action understanders simulate depends not only on the action described, but on what roles the mentioned event participants play in that action, as indicated by grammatical cues like subject and object. Grammar contributes to simulation by putting together all the pieces contributed by words in the right configuration. You use the order of words and other grammatical markers to figure out what properties should go with what entities, and who should be simulating doing what to whom, but combining the simulated content from the individual words is only one of grammar's contributions. Sentences as plans revisited. Let's return to the analogy I mentioned earlier about how words and grammar works. Linguists view sentences like plants, in that words are leaves hanging from the stems of grammar. You can actually get a lot of mileage out of this analogy. Just as leaves perform the primary life function of photosynthesis, so words perform the primary linguistic function of conveying meaning. And just as stems and branches play the support role of holding leaves in place and linking them to the rest of the plant, so grammar supports meaning by placing words in linear order and linking them to the rest of the utterance. In the preceding section, we saw that grammatical structures are responsible for combining words into meaningful utterances, thereby constraining and configuring the assimilation contributions that individual words make. This separation of labor between functional units and their supporting lattices is extremely appealing. But when we push the botanical side a bit, it turns out to be an oversimplification, at least for plants. It is true that in most plants, leaves are responsible for many critical life functions, most notably photosynthesis. And yet, as it turns out, stems are often not content to serve as mere handmaidens to their photosynthesizing masters. Stems, even the woody ones, typical of trees, perform some measure of photosynthesis. In some plants, like cacti, stems actually perform the bulk of photosynthesis. And this is where the analogy between plants and sentences gets really deep. The same is true of grammar. Like branches, grammatical structures serve not only to arrange the forms and meanings of words, they can also contribute meaning of their own. In some cases, their meaning contributions are vague and abstract. In other cases, the broad-stemmed cacti of the grammar world, grammatical structures can be responsible for a large part of an utterance meaning. We'll begin with the argument structure constructions. Patterns that arrange and bind together verbs and the other parts of a sentence. There are lots of them beyond the humble transitive. A frequently discussed example in English is the ditransitive, which you can see at work in sentences like John sent his landlord the check, or the defender kicked his goalie the ball. The structure has a particular form, as seen below. It starts with a noun phrase, followed by a verb, and then two more noun phrases. And here's the thing. In addition to this form, the ditransitive comes with a particular meaning. namely sentences that use ditransive, like the defender kicked his goalie the ball, describe scenes in which the first entity, the defender, transfers the third entity, the ball, to the second entity, the goalie. Said more concisely, ditransitive sentences have a transfer of possession meaning. Although it's clear that the ditransitive sentences, like the ones in Figure 25, do indeed describe transfers of possession, it's reasonable to be skeptical about whether this meaning actually comes from the argument structure construction. After all, it could just as well be the verb write. The verb send, for example, seems like it's mostly about transferring objects. So maybe the meaning of the sentences as a whole is just a combination of the parts that make it up. And the transfer of possession meaning comes from the verb. No need to rely on an argument construction to contribute that. The thing is that when we look a little at the range of verbs that appear using the ditransitive pattern, we find that they include a whole host of other verbs that don't describe all the transfer events. For instance, kick doesn't necessarily denote transfer. Consider typical uses like don't kick your brother or stop kicking, you will fall out of your chair. Only when you use kick with ditransitive grammar context, as in the defender kicked his goalie the ball, does it gain a transfer of possession meaning. The use of verbs like kick in sentences like this indicates that it's possible for verbs that don't necessarily denote transfer to do so when given the right ditransitive argument structure pattern. Nevertheless, we still might not be convinced that the ditransitive grammar is the thing responsible for the transfer of possession meaning. It could be in principle that experts users of English like you have actually learned multiple meanings of kick. One of them denotes an action on some object with a leg or a foot, as in don't kick your brother, and the other denotes such an action performed in such a way that the kicked object is transferred to some third party, as in the defender kicked his goalie the ball. It could be that when you use kick ditransitively, you're merely picking the second of these meanings. And again, grammar doesn't contribute any meaning at all. how can we tease apart whether it's the verb or the grammar that provides a particular meaning? One way is to turn to verbs for which you cannot possibly have memorized a transfer possession meaning. Consider, for example, the verb to motorcycle, as in the delivery boy motorcycle his client some blueprints. To my knowledge, and hopefully as well to yours, this is a totally novel use of this verb. If you ever were to use motorcycle as a verb, which is probably unlikely to begin with, you'd probably use it in the meaning to change location using a motorcycle, as in, we motorcycle down the coast. But I'd be willing to bet that you never heard anyone talk about motorcycling someone something. Yet you have little trouble interpreting the delivery boy motorcycle his client some blueprint. It clearly describes a transfer of possession from delivery boy to the client of some blueprints. Surely, in cases like this one, the transfer of possession meaning must be contributed by the ditransive construction itself, and not the verb. And when you look around, you'll find bountiful examples like this. The typical English speaker has never used tennis racket as a verb, and yet, when confronted with an utterance like Venus tennis racket her sister the hair clip, you know that Venus transferred the hair clip to her sister by means of the tennis racket. In cases like this, the verb again can't be responsible for the transfer of possession meaning because it's not the verb to begin with. Instead, it has to be contributed by the detransitive grammar itself. If you were still skeptical of the claim that it is an argument structure construction, the detransitive, that provides the transfer of possession meaning to these utterances, you could maybe retreat to a weaker position. Maybe you are able to interpret these sentences because of a more general capacity for making inferences. That is, maybe when you put noun phrases describing free entities, one that happens to be capable of causing a transfer, one capable of being transferred, and one capable of receiving a transferred object. In a sentence, the most natural thing for someone to do is to try to make the best sense of the sentence that they can. And so, under these unusual conditions, people use their knowledge about the world, in particular about the particular entities mentioned by the known phrases, to figure out what type of event could have involved them all. But there are several reasons to believe that general inference processes aren't enough, and that people really do bring specific grammatical knowledge to bear on interpreting these sentences. For one, switching the order of the noun phrases following the verb results in sentences that are either meaningless or describe a transfer in the reverse direction. The delivery boy motorcycles some blueprints his client. Is hard to figure out unless one assumes anthropomorphic blueprints and a transferable client. Second, native speakers of many other languages deem sentences of the same type to be ungrammatical. For instance, the French equivalent of the sentence "John sent his landlord the check" is completely unacceptable. No Frenchman in his right mind would accept Jean-Luc a envoyé son propriétaire le chèque as being well-formed French. In sum, because the order matters in detransitive sentences, and because their use seems to be specific to particular languages, like English, but not others like French, it is quite clear that language users are not simply relying on general inference abilities, but rather are using knowledge of a specific grammatical pattern that encodes that transfer of that encodes the transfer of possession meaning. This is also experimental evidence. One study from the University of Wisconsin used several different tasks. In the first experiment, people performed a sentence choice task in which they saw pairs of sentences, such as the ones below. Each sentence in the pair has roughly the same set of words, but they use different argument structure constructions. The first sentence uses the ditransitive we've been working with, Lynn crutched Tom her apple, and an additional phrase, so he wouldn't starve. But the second uses a different construction, that transitive construction that we saw earlier, also along with an additional phrase. Importantly, in these sentences, the verb here, crutch, is not much of a verb at all. Crutch is primarily a noun, but because English allows some nouns to be verbed, it can be forced into service as a verb. Lynn crutched Tom her apples so he wouldn't starve, detransitive. Lynn crutched her apple so Tom wouldn't starve, which is transitive. The researcher had people read both sentences and then look at one of the two inference statements, like the ones you see below. One of the statements was consistent with the purported transfer of possession meaning of the detransitive, while the other was consistent with the purported meaning of the transitive grammar, which, as we saw, is used to describe one entity acting on another. And they asked the participants to indicate which of these two sentences above most strongly implied that the inference statement was true. Inference statements: Tom got the apple, or Lynn acted on the apple. if language users take into account the meanings of argument structure constructions when interpreting a sentence, then they should choose the member of the sentence pair consistent with the inference statement. For instance, they should decide that detransitive Lynn crutched Tom her apple so he wouldn't starve more strongly implies that Tom got the apple. And because the verbs are derived from nouns and do not therefore have transfer of possession meanings to begin with, any such meaning found in the sentence must arise from the grammar, not the verb. As predicted, participants displayed a clear and very strong preference. Ditransitive sentences more strongly imply the transfer of possession meaning. Participants picked the detransitive member of a pair 80% of the time. This strong preference indicates that the presence of the ditransitive construction in a sentence leads understanders to think that the sentence is about transfer of possession. But a single experiment rarely settles a research question definitely. And this one is no exception. As with most experiments, the design of this experiment left open a possible alternative explanation for the results that needed to be teased apart in subsequent work. Namely, it's possible that it was something about the experimental task itself that caused people to prefer one sentence or the other for each inference statement. The experiment explicitly presented participants with a description of the hypothesized transfer of possession meaning of a sentence and asked them to make judgments about sentences. But it could be that people don't typically think of ditransitive sentences as indicating transfer. It only occurs to them when they're prompted to, as in a task like this. In a second experiment, the same researchers tested whether the preference they observed in the first experiment would appear without explicit prompts. So they presented the same sentences and asked people to just paraphrase either the critical sentence or the verb. It turned out that participants were significantly more likely to provide a transfer of possession paraphrase for detransitive sentences than transitive ones. For instance, they might paraphrase the detransitive sentence as Lynn poked at the apple with a crutch to get it to Tom. But the transitive sentences as Lynn poked at the apple with a crutch to break it into pieces. they were also more likely to define the verb as denoting transfer of possession when it was used in a detransitive sentence. Something like to use a crutch to move something to someone. We learn two things from these studies. First, people use grammatical constructions like the detransitive to interpret the meanings of the sentences as a whole. And they use them for a second purpose as well. They also use the meaning of an argument structure construction to make inferences about the meanings of the verbs used with them. The idea that grammatical constructions might be meaningful opens a Pandora's box. How many grammatical constructions are there? And how many different types of sentence have their own specific meanings? Some linguists have gone so far as to argue that every grammatical construction contributes some meaning or function to the utterance it appears in. The idea is that for every difference in linguistic form between the two utterances, whether the order of the words or markers of them, there is a concomitant difference in their meaning or function. This is known as the principle of no synonymy, or the principle of non-equivalence of grammatical forms. Like most principles, it's much easier to prove this tenet wrong than right. The former requires evidence of only grammatical difference that does not affect meaning or function, while the latter requires an exhaustive demonstration that all such formal differences result in meaning differences. Nevertheless, case studies are progressively accumulating, which show at least that many grammatical differences yield meaning differences. Here's an example of a really subtle case. There happens to be another grammatical construction that closely approximates the detransitive in both form and meaning, and that's the caused motion construction. The caused motion construction seen in sentences like John sent his check to the landlord, or the defender kicked the ball to his goalie, differs from the detransitive in terms of its form in just two ways. First, instead of expressing the goal of the action with just a known phrase, like the landlord or his goalie, it inserts a preposition at the beginning to make the landlord or to his goalie. Second, the order of the two entities mentioned after the verb is reversed. Rather than recipient, then object as in the detransitive, the caused motion construction mentions the object, then the recipient. Some theories of syntax claim that there are so many similarities between detransitive and caused motion sentences that they ought to be treated as superficially different versions of the same underlying structure. And although this account is appealing for its simplicity and parsimony, the two constructions differ in enough ways that they can be shown to be clearly distinct. For one, there's a range of differences between them in how they are used, including how formal the discourse is, which of the entities after the verb is new to the discourse, and which is longer. Another key difference between the detransitive and the coast motion constructions is in the verbs that they allow to appear in them. It appears that the coast motion construction is slightly more permissive than the detransitive in this regard, such that some verbs are perfectly acceptable only with the former, according to many native English speakers. It's fine to contribute some time to a cause, but unacceptable to contribute a cause some time. But do these two constructions also differ in meaning? Do the embodied simulations driven by these two grammatical constructions differ at all? There are subtle differences in how the two constructions are used, ones you probably never noticed before. For instance, it appears perfectly acceptable to suggest that you will throw your keys to the floor, but it is strange to say that you will throw through the floor your keys. Most native speakers of English have the intuition that the first caused motion version can indicate that you move the keys to a new location, the floor, by means of throwing them. By contrast, in order for the detransitive version, through the floor the keys to make sense, the word floor has to refer to some set of relevant people associated with the floor. Perhaps the people currently standing there. And you get the same asymmetry between the detransitive and coast motion constructions when you compare the outfielder hit the foot fastball to the left field wall, which should sound fine, with the outfielder hit the left field wall, the fastball, which should only sound reasonable if the left field wall stands for someone located there. Like maybe fans leaning over it. So it appears that despite superficial similarities, the detransitive and the coast motion constructions actually differ in terms of the meanings they convey. The detransitive describes an intended transfer of an object to a recipient. And naturally, a recipient must be capable of receiving something. A floor or a wall isn't a good recipient. And so to interpret a detransitive sentence in which a floor or a wall is placed in this role, we have to use some other means to interpret floor or wall such that they do indicate a recipient. By contrast, the caused motion construction appears to describe scenes in which some entity causes another entity to move along a path. A floor or wall can be endpoints of such a motion, as can any location, so the caused motion versions of these sentences are perfectly easy to interpret. There's additional linguistic evidence for this distinction between the caused motion and the transitive constructions. If a caused motion construction really conveys a meaning of caused motion along a path, then it should be compatible not only with the preposition to, but with any similar preposition. So we can not only bring the ladder to the wall, but also lean the ladder against the wall. We can not only carry coals to Newcastle, but also place the remains in the ground. However, in agreement with its claim, transfer position meaning, the detransitive doesn't allow these configurations. In fact, it is quite difficult to imagine what it would mean to lean the wall, the ladder, or place the grounds, the remains. Let's turn to the question of whether embodied simulation differs when you hear them. What predictions might we make? If the caused motion construction highlights the motion of an object along a path, while the detransitive does not, focusing instead on the transfer of possession, then when you hear caused motion constructions, you should construct more detailed embodied simulation of the described path of motion. For instance, one difference between the caused motion, you are sliding the cafeteria tray to Sally, and the detransitive, you are sliding Sally the cafeteria tray, might be that the caused motion version causes you to perform more detailed embodied simulation of motion. Causes you to perform more detailed embodied simulation of the motion of the tray away from your body and towards Sally than the detransitive version does. We actually tested this hypothesis in our lab. The logic went like this. Suppose we have people listen to caused motion or detransitive sentences that describe moving an object along a path with your hand. And then right afterward, we have them move their own hands along a different path. if the caused motion sentences lead to more simulation of their paths, then they should interfere more than the detransitive sentences with the subsequent actual hand motion. This is how we set it up. First, we had the people look at a grid on a computer monitor, like the one that is depicted in figure 26. It's a long alley with cubes. They had to click on the dark box in the foreground to hear a sentence. Then the sentence played aloud. It used either the caused motion or the transitive construction, describing you moving an object away from your body, just like the Sally sentences. Right after each sentence, a bullseye appeared somewhere on the grid, and the participants had to move their hand to click on it. If caused motion sentences drive people to construct more intense or detailed simulations of the path of motion, then this should affect the hand movements they perform after hearing caused motion sentences about hand motion more than with detransitive sentences. In particular, if they're mentally simulating moving their hand along a path to understand a caused motion sentence, then when called upon to subsequently move their hand along a path, they should do so for a longer time. As you can see from the results in figure 27, this is what we found. People move their hand for longer after caused motion sentences than detransitive ones. So caused motion sentences appear to produce more detailed embodied simulation of the path of motion than detransitive. Different argument structure constructions really do seem to contribute meaning to be mentally stimulated. It appears that the analogy between plans and utterances is even more apt than previously thought. Just as stems can photosynthesize, so grammatical constructions can convey meaning that is directly fleshed out in concrete components of an embodied simulation. How grammar modulates our perspective. Next paragraph. There's actually a third way that grammar contributes to simulation. Sorry, mid-sentence, why? There's actually a third way that grammar contributes to simulation. It also tells you not what to simulate, but how to simulate it. Even if you know what entities and events a sentence describes, some properties of embodied simulation are nevertheless underspecified. For instance, take a sentence like, the driver gripped the steering wheel and pounded the horn as he waited for the light to change. What perspective do you adopt when you mentally simulate this event? The perspective of the driver or of an outside observer? You can tell which you choose because the different perspectives lead to very different simulations. If you are simulating yourself as the driver, you'll be projecting your own visual system into that of the driver, so that you see what the driver would see. A steering wheel with hands gripping it in front of a windshield through which the street and perhaps a stoplight are visible. Creating a simulation from the perspective of someone taking part in an event takes a participant perspective. But you can also simulate an event from an observer's perspective. If you're not the driver but merely an observer, you can place your imagined eye, the mind's camera, at any number of other locations. For example, it could be directly placed behind the driver. This would be nearly identical to the participant's perspective, except that it would also include the back of the driver's head. Or it could be placed outside of the car to one side or in front, so that it includes the car along with the driver. Or it could be a view from the front of the car that sees the driver through the windshield. Which perspective you adopt is important, because it will radically affect your embodied simulation of an event. And you just don't pick a perspective at random. Research on which perspectives people adopt and why has mostly focused not on language but on memory. As it turns out, you are more likely to adopt a participant perspective when recalling events that you have a positive attitude toward. Like your favorite birthday memory, or rather the ones you have a negative attitude toward, like your least favorite birthday memory. You are also more likely to adopt a participant perspective when you judge yourself to have changed little since the recalled event. For instance, if you're recalling going to your childhood church and you're still religious, than when you feel you've changed a lot since then. At the biological level, visual imagery from these two perspectives differs both in where the neural structures that support it are located and in which brain hemisphere dominates its performance. Now, when comprehending language, there's more than just your relationship to the described event in play. You also have the utterance itself. And as we'll see, it seems like grammar can push your perspective around too. Let's turn to the sentence we saw above. The driver gripped the steering wheel and pounded on the horn as he waited for the light to change. When people first read a sentence like this, more often than not, they adopt an observer perspective. They see the driver gripping, pounding, and waiting from an external vantage point, but a tiny grammatical modification in the sentence can change that. Suppose we modify the subject of the sentence to make it, "You gripped the steering wheel and pounded on the horn as you waited for the light to change." If you're like most people, you probably have the intuition that the second person subject, you, makes you more likely to adopt a participant perspective. This observation leads to an intriguing idea. Maybe grammatical persons. First person I, second person you, third person he or she orchestrates the perspective you simulate from. We run a series of experiments in our lab to investigate this question. We wanted to find a set of events that would look different depending on the perspective they were viewed from, and we came up with events in which an object moves away from someone. When you move an object away from you, it appears to get smaller. But when you see someone else moving an object away from them, at least when you see the action from the side, it changes position laterally without necessarily changing in apparent size. So the same event, an object moving away from someone, looks different depending on whether you are that someone or not. As we reason that the same should be true when you are simulating objects moving away from you versus from someone else. So if second person language about objects moving away from you leads people to simulate from a participant perspective, then they should simulate the objects getting smaller. But if the third person language, the pitcher threw the baseball to the catcher, leads people to simulate from an observer perspective, then they should be simulating objects being displaced laterally, but not necessarily changing in size. Here's how we tested this idea. We had people listen to sentences describing motion away from someone, like someone throwing a baseball, and gave them either a second person subject, you, or a third person subject, the pitcher. These sentences were interleaved with a second task, which participants thought was totally unrelated. Immediately following each sentence, two pictures popped up on the screen in quick succession, and participants had to press buttons labeled yes or no to indicate whether the two pictures depicted the same object. And here's the catch. When the two objects were the same, we manipulated how the second of the two images looked so that in combination with the first image, it looked like the object was either moving away from the participant or from their left to right. The way we did this was pretty simple. The first image appeared briefly at the center of the screen, followed by an even shorter visual mask. Then the second image appeared, either offset a little to the right and the same size as the first image, or at the center of the screen, slightly smaller in both height and width than the first image. The figure shows a stop motion version of the rightful moving condition and the away moving condition. The trick is that because the images were each presented for just half a second, they produce the optical illusion of a single object, moving either to the right or away from the participant. Research we looked over in Chapter 3, using a similar method, had previously shown that sentences with second-person pronouns led to faster responses to images when the objects move in the direction you would see them moving in. For instance, you threw the baseball to the catcher facilitates responses to objects that appear to be moving away. We anticipated that we would be able to replicate this finding in our sentences that had you as the subject. But why did we think that people would simulate externally observed motion as going from left to right? An observer perspective simulation of a scene like the pitcher threw the baseball to the catcher, for example, can adopt a number of different vantage points, from being either of the participants, from the side, from above, and so on. However, there's actually some research showing that English speakers most commonly simulate horizontal motion as progressing from the left to the right. So we reasoned that when native English speakers mentally simulate motion from an observer perspective, that motion should tend to progress from the left to the right. So in the experiment we contrasted motion that appeared to be moving away from people with motion to their right. If people adopt a participant perspective when you is the subject, they should categorize objects moving away from them faster, and if they adopt a particular perspective when someone else is the subject, categorization of rightward moving objects should be faster. And this is precisely what the data in figure 29 shown as depicted here. People responded significantly faster when the perspective induced by the grammatical person and that of the subsequently moving images were compatible. This suggests that person acts as a grammatical cue that modulates the character of embodied simulations. In particular, that who is described as engaging in an activity affects the perspective we're more likely to adopt in mentally representing that activity. Experimental results are always most convincing when they are convergent. When other work done in other labs using different methods points to the same conclusions. Researchers at Tufts found a related effect using a very different methodology. In a pair of studies, they had people read sentences with different subjects. I, you, or he. The sentences described hand actions like slicing a tomato or ironing pants. Then after each sentence, people saw a picture taken either from the perspective of the doer or from across the doer, which is an observed perspective picture. The task was to decide whether the picture showed the action described in the preceding sentences. What they found was that people were faster to say that participant perspective picture matched the action following sentences about you, but they were faster with the observed perspective picture following sentences about he. This reinforces the findings from the object motion directing study in Chapter 3. But there was an interesting additional result from this work. What perspective would people adopt when they read first-person sentences about I? Would these sentences work more like you sentences, evoking a participant perspective, or like he sentences? Evoking an observer perspective? It might go either way. When someone is talking about himself or herself, you can simulate the thing they're describing from either their perspective or an outside perspective. And that's what the researchers found. In the first experiment, people responded faster after I sentences to the participant perspective pictures than the observer perspective pictures. That is, they simulated what it would be like for them to be in the role of I. But in a second experiment, the researchers added a little context to the mix. They preceded each sentence with a setup describing who I was, for instance. I'm a 30-year-old Delhi employee. I'm making a vegetable wrap. Right now, I'm slicing a tomato. In this setup, people were faster to respond to the observer perspective pictures after I sentences. That is, they were simulating someone else slicing the tomato. One explanation for this is that people are more likely to adopt an observer perspective when they hear I and have a concrete image of the person who's speaking or writing. The more detail the context gives about that person, the more able the comprehender is to represent what that person is like. By contrast, they're more likely to think of I as referring to themselves when they don't have any idea who the writer or speaker is. I think we'll have to continue later on. say thank you very much and have a pleasant afternoon.